다 가장 kanshi tata dungi we yijung tenda dang yingis, chade ma yins.
Yesterday we looked at that verse which says, whatever disenchantment arises from present suffering is aversion, not freedom from attachment.
That deba, tangbo digi deba de lona, sowa dungi gi yijung we chade te, chade ma yin batal, the
commentary for that immediate first two lines is disenchantment free of attachment, disenchantment free from attachment that arises from feelings of suffering is not freedom from suffering because at that time there is attachment to a self.
So that the gumzin chikche. Tetse yang cha yu sek zawagi tetse yang cha yu sek gumzin chikche.
So this one is the first reason, and then the second reason, and because one seeks other occasions for happiness, which is the fourth line of the verse, which says, because at that time there is attachment and one seeks other occasions. And so that's the second one, which is seeks other occasions for happiness.
Oh, yeah. Da chade mai bi jumjendre da sowa dungi gi da sowa dungi gi yi jungwe ani chadel sen da khaji gi she sha ba ji yorwa di chöjen la sha korang so gi chade khelen de sowa dungi gi yi jungje dela chagwa da teres korang so gi labde gi dinde gi chade sowa dungi gi yi jungwe chade di chöjens dela chade mai ba tha jumjen garere di se dala chagwa yobe shes gumjin chik ani dewe kapshen sowe shes gumjin ni she.
So when you see in the subject it says disenchantment free from attachment. This disenchantment free from attachment is what the opponent considers disenchantment free from attachment. So whatever they consider to be this disenchantment, which then they deem free from attachment. So that's the subject. Subject refers to disenchantment as described by them. So take disenchantment freed from attachment that arises from feelings of suffering. It follows it is not freedom from suffering because at that time there is attachment to the self and because one seeks other occasions for happiness.
Da chöjen rangja che tende de chade mayin batal de chade mayin bata dungel gi dungbi yijun the shedan da chungden yin bi shis da de gumjen sumba che.
So with the same subject, which is the disenchantment freed from attachment that arises from feelings of suffering, and then it follows it is not freedom from attachment, again, because that disenchantment that is overwhelmed by suffering is concomitant with aversion. So this is a third reason why it's not freedom from attachment or free from suffering.
Da dangi kongi gumjin shi to dile khaba dil apson tugurwa dala chakwa yoba tang dewe kapshen solwa ina dewe kapshen solguduna tado chakwa da tremewa di lapto gurwa da tanda di dungi gi dungbe yijung di shedan da chungden yimbe di khaba khandi suyores laba ina khaba yodes dene chorwa dungi gi gyujin yimbe chirs khaba yode dene chorwa dungi gi gyujin yimbe chirse.
So for the first two reasons, that there is attachment to the self and because one seeks other occasions for happiness, proving the pervasion that if there is attachment to self and one seeks other occasions for happiness, it follows there is no freedom from suffering. That you can still prove with respect to the third one, which is because it is concomitant with aversion, to prove the pervasion. So then the commentary carries on. There is pervasion that if it is concomitant with suffering, it follows it is not freedom from attachment because it is the result of feelings of suffering.
So that sowa dungi gi gyujin yimba yina sowa dungi gi gyujin yimba yina ane chade ma yimba khandis lapto gures lana dungi te chade ma yimba tal dungel yoba thisi du negi dungen thakbo de loba na 기부디 랑니기 ngarge rangshin chajingila lar temba gyubi cheros odire.
And so again, how is this proving the pervasion that if it is the result of feelings of suffering, why does it have to follow that it cannot be free from attachment or it cannot be free from suffering? And the reason is, it follows it is not freedom from attachment because it lasts only as long as there is suffering, and when that intense suffering is reversed, the person will once again revert to their previous nature of having attachment.
Sonza zawa che yundu dungi gyujin chir teni tisi samdu ne telo nani rangi ki rangshin yila lar ten gyurus.
So this last section is explaining the last 4 lines, which is, since aversion is a result of suffering, it lasts only as long as that exists. If reversed, one will once again revert to their nature.
So zata kibuchigla chaksimgi kibuchigla chaje. Tene kanzam jine ya kibuti nyamdo se shorwam tindegi gencheje lung chakbo langwe khadu dela halam tela ngar tela tsem yoba nashin tsem de mebe nashin gi nambachi sha yugurde denla tsem de yobe ta garela na tanda chorwa tse shoji chorwa dungi yobe ring tela pajo dela magawa shu yobe namju soro ji yorde ani tindegi chorwa dungi de madu jambada ngar gi tsewa dela parangja lo rugudu ngar gi chaba dela parangja lo rugudu tinga zo nyongwale yorwa odi shekorda.
So for instance, the example that is being given here is, if one is very fond or cares about someone very much, even though you might have a disagreement or you might have an argument, which then leads to frustration or anger with the other person, the fact that that anger does not mean that there is an absence of care and concern for that other person is evident from the fact that when your anger subsides, then naturally that earlier state of being caring or having strong feelings for them, that returns. And so because this is obvious in the sense that we all experience this fact is being used here to illustrate why it's not freedom from attachment.
So that di zawa digi kangdarya chowa dungi kandada chowa dungi samlo tangche. Takanda ngobu teta tela tene chowa dungi shu thabu ke yongdu dindegi chowa dungi digi thone ngobu teta tela chakwa da tigi yore samba yina takta ji chowa dungi tesamgi ani phagegi ngobu tela chakwa da thewa te tugi meba di odi sungi yorta.
So what it's saying over here is, when you have a strong resultant feeling of suffering that arises, or pain that arises with respect to something, even though you might feel that in that moment there is an absence of attachment, this cannot be considered a definitive freedom from attachment towards that thing, just because for that time span, for that determined period, you might not have any attachment to them.
Ta dungi gi yijungwe chade de chade mayina chade mayimba lapsadu ani ta chade sena khande dobuji yores keje shen yudu chade ngwe songwas.
And so then after all of these various refutations, they're asked, if one wonders and says, so then what exactly is, how do you define or how do you understand freedom from attachment? This is the next section which says identifying freedom from attachment.
Langda torja pangbichir tamje lani nyamsemje zenden tiu chongbala chade sheni jobayis.
Having abandoned adopting and rejecting things, one who is equanimous to all, remaining similarly towards sandalwood and an axe, they are said to be free from attachment.
Deba lula zenden gi chukba tha tiu joba nila niring mebar semnyam nyombar chungbi kibu thela chagdel she joba yinde langja da torjala shemba pangbichirs.
The commentary is, someone whose mind remains in a state of equanimity without partiality when one's body is being anointed with sandalwood paste or being cut by an axe is said to be free from attachment because they have abandoned conceiving of things as being something to be adopted or rejected.
So that pedi thanda ko laburwa kansaji lula zending chuba shoye ne lula zending chuba chu shoyen la ani teugi ani ludini shadu che deba yena dindigi kansa digi kansa nyubo thela ani nyering meba semnyamba dus jugdiya chi ta di semnyamba jugdiya theya gyu khari wangi semnyamba jugbares laba yena juge di ani langdur gi shemba medeba reswa ta dinini chigi chugba choyungdu zendingi chugba choyungdu tela chagba sem medeba tela su langjagi shemba medeba dine sujo dine tiwigi che yungdu sorwa dungi yungu yorde tela torjagi shemba medeba sonza langdurgi shemba medeba dindigi gyumzengi langda torja pangbi chir di gyumzengi kansa nibu dela sem nyombor jugsona o dindidila chadesla biyores.
So the example is quite clear. The example that's being illustrated is say for instance, on one's right side, there is sandalwood paste that is being massaged into the body. Physically that feels good. So there might be physical pleasure, but the mind does not conceive of that as something to be adopted. And so then there is no attachment towards that. While on the other side, on the left side, if someone is using an axe or a sharp blade to cut pieces of skin away, even though physically there may be pain, the mind is free of conceiving. It's absent. The conceiving of that as something to be rejected is absent. It's not there, which is why there's no aversion to that. And so someone who can rest in that state, because they have abandoned the conception of things being to be adopted or rejected, such a state, such a person is called to be one who is free from attachment.
So that tanda dela langda torja pangbichir se gyumzen di songsowa. Yagi kang langa du zawa jignala karichimbare langda torja keyo na jigli chugen, jigli chungwe chagan yin dini namrang kechi se chakbagungi sabyo yins kazan gana jik chinsa sowa. So di yindu langja dan torja gi shenpa yo na langdor gi shenpa yo ba yina shenpa di pang me na ani chakba di yo re. Chakba yo ba yindu ani jigla chakba sabyon tegarangi jigla chakba digi sabyon shene shenpa la yin chakba kebi gyuchigi res. Kazan gazu ya gana chimbarwa. Da tanda dela ma song yundu dindigi kansa digi simjin nibo dela chakdang miyungo wadi gyumzen kare la na langja da torja gi shenpa di pang saba res. Geji di shia songa. Di yundu langda torja pang bichir se di dagi dushi yuebi tone ani langdor geji shiriyadi. Dagi dushi yuebi tone ngala di go mindu seyadi. Soza dagi dushi mashik bache dagi dushi yuebi tone ngala di go mindu la chinje la kare charu gore. Ani chakba di teyo mara yore sigota. Ta dagi dushi di shikso na ani dagi dushi di shikba yina ani ngala dewa di dungi di go mindu seyagi dindigi ta yugi langja do torja zimba di gaadore. Di meba yindu ani tandagi chadang mebe lo di yungu yores, ta chadi di yungu yores, odi shigi yorda.
So along with this verse, if you remember, there was a verse above, which said, if differences between what to adopt and reject exist, whatever attachment arises from one, when produced by similar conditions, is the seed of all attachment. And so here, it was on page 45. Here again, what is being said is, when you have the conception of things to be adopted and things to be rejected, that lead to attachment and aversion, this person who is free from attachment is someone who does not have this does not conceive of things as something to be adopted or as something to be rejected. Which is why, while these two people are harming them from different sides, because this conceiving of or perceiving of or apprehending things as something to be adopted or something to be rejected is absent from their mind, or it has been abandoned, this way of discriminating things, they are in a state that is free from attachment. So, for instance, what's being said here is, if there is a conception of the self, or one conceives of a self, and through this conceiving of a self, one has an idea that this is to be adopted or this is to be rejected, then acting out of this, one has attachment and aversion. And so one will not be able to remove attachment and aversion, because as long as there is a notion of a self, it will naturally find things to be adopted and things to be rejected. This discrimination will be natural as long as the self is conceived of. When this conception of the self is removed or is no longer there, there is no more the idea of I want to be happy, I do not want to suffer. And because this discrimination is not there, there is no room for identifying things as something to be abandoned or something to be adopted. And so that is when one attains a state here that is free from attachment.
다단다 랑자도 돌자 타직도 셴바 유세야 되다 랑도르도 셴바 유바다 단다데 안에 랑도르도 셴바 빵와세 랑자도 돌자라 셴바 빵세게 빵당자부디 다기 두시시비가네 빵당디게 지시기요.
So ahead where it was saying there is a notion or there is conceiving of things as something to be adopted, something to be rejected, and here where it's saying having abandoned adopting and rejecting things, this removal of such conception or this removal of such, I guess, perception, apprehending things in this way, is removed through removing the notion of the self. It's not another way. The way it's talking about it over here is through eliminating conceiving of a self.
Tsiribi dindi dishi kyago sigidwa. Sishing dinzo. Sishing rig dinzo la. Koran sala pemba kare yobadi. Tata suduk. Neba kare yobadi koran ngungo chayagi. Koran la rangshingi di. Rangshingi segorbe di laga chayagi di yor sigidwa.
So scientists, they do somehow speak of the trees or plants that are able to take things that are useful for their existence and they are able to get rid of things that are not useful for their existence. Like they have this function of taking things that are required and removing things that are not required.
이나야 지 행동 되게 딩이 랑자를 해서지 랑제기 두시에다 딩이 돌자를 해서지 돌자기 두시 깨져요 말와.
But they do not have this way of conceiving of things as something to be adopted or something to be rejected.
디인도 셈기양 셈디기 넘버 셔바기양 코란라 펜비 차카인 바디 두스랑 코란라 네비 차카인 바디 두스토르 셈기 토네야 차와 대가는 지혜요.
Similarly with the mind also there is a way of functioning or acting where things that are of use or things that are useful can be I guess taken, and things that are not useful can be kind of gotten rid of.
소자다 세메 변복이 지신기 리기 두스 제투고 여바 나시 셈기데 대외경 제투고로 보고 딜린 누버치와 이고 제투고로 봐. 제투고 여바 인도 디바로 될라 다기 두시디 레고예요. 맞다 디시다. 다 디바로 될라 가서 다기 두시디 쭉지 아니 강이디 속이요 봐. 디인도 다기 두시디 디바로 레고예요. 맞 디인도 다기 두시 식제 그런 내가 제도에 연구해 봐.
So if inanimate things can function in this way where whatever is of use is naturally kind of taken and what is not required is gotten rid of, the mind, which can also function in a similar way, can not only function in a similar way, but it's even more potent. But the problem, if you will, is that when this conception of a self comes and infiltrates and kind of taints the situation, then the way in which it functions gets compromised. But there is no need for its ability to just function normally by taking things that are useful and getting rid of things that are not, to go when the notion of the self goes away. There is a way of functioning of the mind, much like the inanimate world, that is still doable or that still happens without this notion of a self.
다 지신라 가리평기 요래 가린뉴기 요래 디기 삼로당 뒤에다 두시시 디릭 두시기 뉴바요 말와 이나 코란 내가 제루도와 셈라 가리요르라나 기준이 열다 코란라 펜비 차디도 네비 차디 두스 직디 알렌 직디 돌아야기 직 돌아선도 마세 펜바디 펜비 규인바도 뇌바디 뇌비 규인 셈기 ngoshe 두고 열어다 셈기 ngoshe 두고 열어봐 디인디 다기 뒤시 짜왕이니 미국에 토네 셈기 레가데 딱딱 제 두고 열 거랑 셈 거랑 레가데 젠로 두고 열다.
And again, unlike inanimate things that still do these actions, they still perform actions that I guess are fruitful for their survival or for them to exist, and they can react against things that are not useful or that are detrimental to their well-being. The mind, apart from being able to perform the same action, has this added quality of knowing which causes are useful and what causes are detrimental. And again, for it to be able to do this function or perform these actions while knowing that this is going to lead to this result and this is going to lead to another kind of result, for all of this to function and all of this to happen, there is no requirement of this notion of a self that has to come in between.
다 단디 찰랑 아란 속이 초와날 가리요래 다기 뒤시 매베 톤네 랑도르 계제셔서 요마르 가졸라 다기 삼로 마코네 랑도르 삼로 마코르베 까 민두왕 가졸라 매베 인데 딱 가조 태좀 사초고로 봐 독바 사이 사고로 봐 다기 뒤시 매나 랑도르 가데 셰투고요나 세 가조 독바 지 레베지 응구로 왕 가졸라.
Because we don't have any way of conceiving of adopting things and rejecting things without it being kind of grounded or steered by this notion of a self. When we think of the absence of this self, it's quite natural to wonder, well then if there is no self, then what is the reason for adopting or rejecting certain things? That's maybe why we have this doubt.
Right? 다 남보상계비기 주도음이기 흉내야도 계제셔연데 아니 다 당당한 쪽이 삼로코데와 나시기 다기 뒤시디 매버이나야 넘버 쉐바 코란 삼경하니 아니 랑도 레가 체도에 여버지 계제시기요. 디니 주도 공말 야레 용디 야 주도 오마수기 삼로코고로와 데몽고부테다 데 덴버 요마레 스케제시 줌바르 덴버 요마레 시도 아니 줌바이나 랑도 칸디 시기 사면데 줌바이나야 랑도 시기레서 야 랑도 시기 남세직 시용 다 칸다 두 체제 차로 도시로.
So according to like the various presentations of Buddhist schools, in the first tenets, the way that is what is being kind of described as an alternative model where in the absence of the self or the notion of a self, so with no real agent that is a self, there is still functioning that can happen. The mind can still act and do things, even though there is no agency in this self. So without the notion of a self, the mind can still act. And so this is what their presentation is, that you don't need, this self is not fundamental to act and do things. Consciousness is able to do that. And as you move on to the later tenets or the higher tenets, the doubt that arises with their presentation is you're saying nothing is real. If nothing is real, then how do things act? How do things function? And they have their own presentation of an alternative model of how in the absence of things being real and when things are fake, its functionality and the fact that they can act and perform functions is not compromised. And so as you study the various schools, you find that this presentation gets progressively subtler or more refined.
Odrisha, ta dindu ta dinima kajigi yan disungore. Ta kerangi ngala nambosangi kerangi ngala chirubala. Ta dungyen gomba digi chakwa de tewa chetugu mare, dungyen gomba di chakwa tijegi lam mare digi kerangi nejo mangbo shiuchi tangsons. Dindi ina ane dungyen gomba goba keyo marwas. Ko ke pen thogmena. ane dungyen gomba di ke chumba yemba di keranso shungna la segi nangba sangi bi keranso shunga ya dungyen gomba di shiu songu duwas. ane di karchi songba la gewa charu dos. Wadi sungin di dungyen gomba songba da gewa pangwa asayate.
Can you just come to page 47? I think I made a mistake in the translation. You see the commentary? Disenchantment free from attachment that arises from feelings of suffering is not freedom from suffering. Does yours have suffering? Can you change it to freedom from attachment, please? Yeah? Is that okay? Did everyone get it? Page 47, you see the commentary, the last one? In the second line, it says freedom from suffering because. Does it have that? Yes? Yeah? Can you change that to freedom from attachment? Is that okay? Yeah? Disenchantment free from attachment that arises from feelings of suffering is not freedom from attachment. Yeah? Then the next, so that's okay. The next section is after we finish the one that we just did, then the next point that is being addressed is after the Buddhists or after Acharya Dharmakirti here has refuted others' presentations of getting rid of attachment and getting rid of suffering through all the various means that they have suggested, when the Buddhists keep saying that's not an alternative, that's not a method, that does not lead to suffering. Now the next section is, well, if all of these methods that we are speaking of are not ways to attain liberation from suffering, then what's the point of meditating on suffering? As it means to attain liberation, it's irrelevant, but then if that is irrelevant or it's insignificant, your own teachings, the Buddha himself has said that one has to meditate on suffering. What's the purpose of that? So there is no benefit to meditating on suffering. Your teacher says that. So there is a contradiction between you refuting that as a means to attain liberation and your teacher saying that you have to meditate on suffering. So the next section is refuting that this contradicts the Buddha's teachings on meditating on suffering.
That's our duje dunge lagone dunge gombar sungbayi ngegi teya kenleke tene dame ngegi teya kenleke tene dame tadens toni tawe chogyuwe choba gyur gombal hama tedens tijirmida le dunge lene dame songs.
The verse then reads, with conditioned suffering in mind, meditating on suffering was said, moreover, ours arise from conditions. That is the basis of the view of non-self. That is the basis of the view of non-self. The view of emptiness liberates, the remaining meditations are for this purpose. Therefore, it was taught that from impermanence comes suffering, and from suffering comes no self.
Ta nyelengi pungbo dungil du gombar sungba ni nyebe ten samshi gombar sungba ma yinki. Lenyengi shawanjingi dujigi dungil du gombar sungba yins.
And the commentary says, teachings regarding meditating on suffering of the appropriated aggregates do not refer solely to realizing that they are the support of faults. Instead, they were taught to meditate on conditioned suffering, taught for one to meditate, taught for one, or whatever, to meditate on conditioned suffering that is under the power of karma and afflictions.
That namju slaw mendo. Da ale dishe gyabdan dus khowa tangbo khowa denish lenda. Gyu member checking gi lam chikdan gyu tholwar checking gi lam sech da lam ni yorwa nga zu minji gi lam sech da tholje gi lam sech ko gyu member chenge chikdan gyu tholwar chenge chik ni she gorwa.
So when one talks about the paths to be cultivated, there are generally two kinds of paths that are mentioned. One are maturing paths. Is that what we call it in English? What do we translate it as? One are paths that liberate, maturing paths, and liberating paths. No, maturing paths are practices that you do, that you cultivate a certain path that matures your realization. It leads to the maturation of the realization. And then there are paths that you cultivate that lead to freedom, liberation. So those are, I think in English they're translated as paths that mature and paths that liberate. Huh? No.
Ta pedo pela kongola na sigdi ta yu me na pedo ko la shabe na. Ta nganzo sashi yorwa. Ta sashi tela saben tabche tele ani nganzo lodo mingorwa. Nyugu mingorwa. So zata nyugu minghen di kare. Nyugu mimbar checking gyudi kare la na saben che. Saben durwa. Ta saben di tabsagi shidi kare sashi durwa. Ta di yundu an kete sashi di lodo kiela sashi di mimbuji mena chakbu dawu dende yinba yina an tela saben luwa zamgi saben nyugu kero chigi marwa. Di yundu ko saben tele nyugu pa mimbar kiela sashi di cho che tuyeji gugu yoba yundu ngela nganzo karchi gore ani shingme che tanda de shingba zu shingme ni sha so dina shi sa de tang min bu sue che ba sa de pa ya ku sue che kanda de la sabyen ta ba yina nyugu ke chojo so je sa de la chik su gu du wa de la ngadu di se gor wa sa shi di nyugu ke la member che ya ge ko cho che ke je shi du wa o de la ku yu ta.
I think in English it might be ripening paths. You know how you say ripening empowerment? That's the same word. The example is, for instance, if you want to get a crop, for that crop to arise, along with the seed, you also need a field that is ripe in the sense that it is a field that is conducive, that makes a conducive place for that sprout to arise, for that crop to grow. So for instance, like right now, the farmers outside, they have plowed their field and they have put manure and they have put fertilizers. All of that is done to be able to ripen the conditions for that sprout to arise.
다 뉴구 원에 개버 싱이 사병 코라마도 단다 디마르와 사시 멤버 싱이기 든조 사시 멤버 싱이기 규든조 아니 뉴구 개버 싱이기 규문에 디마르와 사병 코라 뉴구 개버 싱이 원에 차들와.
So the one that will really produce, or the one that actually produces the crop, are the seeds that you put. And it's not these ripening causes, which are other factors that assist in making that happen. So the other causes are known here as ripening causes, and then there would be the real producing cause. So the real producing cause is the one that actually produces the sprout. The other ones are assisting factors that are known as ripening causes.
petition도 다 철제기 람 슬랍디 가왈리 철바 코르발리 파 철버 칭이기 람 세고르와 코왈리 토버 칭이기 람 세인데 코왈리 철 마주바 디기 독초 코왈라 파 징디기 자와디 당진기 지기 요바 인디 당진기 캅디 조딩에 될라 당진도 진앙기 로델라 철제기 람스 딱한다 당진 메버 소퉁이기 람 될라 철제기 람 다 코란 람티 카두 당지 메버 소투고 요 마레테 얘네야 당지 메버 소야래 갑된 체디 킹게 다 고로바 체딩이 서포터 소도 시주 셈 레소롱와 체야 어딘데기 로고 체딩이 된졸라 민지기 람스.
So similarly, when you talk about ripening paths and liberating paths, what is called a liberating path is the one that is able to counter what prevents liberation. And what prevents liberation, or what keeps one trapped in samsara, is the view of the self or conceiving of a self. And the only thing that can liberate from this view or this self-grasping is a mind that is cultivating a mode of apprehension that is directly contradictory with the way in which self-grasping conceives of its object. Even though this is the only liberating path, there are other things that cannot liberate, but they make the mind conducive, or they make it favorable to be able to cultivate this kind of liberating path. So the other practices or the other paths that are used, the other methods that are not directly liberating, but make the situation conducive for that wisdom realizing selflessness to arise, are known as ripening paths. And the other one that is directly countering the cause of existence is known as the liberating path.
다음에 또 비셔라도 졸제기 남인데 다음에 공바다 다음에 똑바다 된소 가도 연구를 라바이나 아니 응엘라 다음에 철거로 미디 다음에 철거로 다음에 천득 로게고로 다음에 천득 로게발라 다음에 디기 둥에기 자와치기 요바 야면은 예바 착속이 자와치기 요바 딘디직 마통기 링텔라 그 다음에 책이 고르마로 다음에 책 고바 고려요 말와 책을 누구 고르마로 디 다음에 책을 로발롱에라 다음에 둥에기 자와지든 예바 착속이 자와지 강run치라 통고고도 와 디인디 다 딘디 통외 람디 가르래 다음에 되비 셰럽 곰발라 토칭이 디인디 콜라 민지게 람스.
So for someone to cultivate what is now what we are calling the liberating path, which is the mind that realizes selflessness, to be able to cultivate it or to even seek it out. For instance, someone who is not concerned with trying to find out why they are suffering or what the causes for suffering are, or what the causes are, whether these causes for suffering can be done away with or removed, there is no benefit. Like, they will not seek out selflessness, or they will not try to understand selflessness. So what are the various things that are required to make the mind favorable, or make the mind first be concerned with and then able to understand selflessness? So what is it that makes the mind want to seek out selflessness and then realize it? Everything that one does, or everything that is required for that to arise, are known here, are what is being referred to here as the ripening paths.
대인도 다 동행 공부를 송바디 동행의 민지기 람도 시에는 공부를 깨지 시기 요마도 주제기 람도 숨는 공부디 시기 요 말이에요. 다 디시직 된대요 그래.
So one way of describing this, so this is one way of understanding what is being said, is when the Buddha speaks of suffering, the path that is meditating on suffering has been spoken of not as a liberating path, but as a ripening path. So that's one way to understand what is being said.
다 니버디 가르시고스네 대신 니버들라 고아 랑초지라 가르여스라바이나 아니 동해 텔라 두제기 동해당 아니 가조 남지 셰디에기 다 동해기 남당 숨시기로 와 두제기 동해 그룹이 동해 아니 동해기 동해에서 정가도 동해 남랑 민다와 숨시기요 와 숨시기 여바인데 다다 커지기 단다 단기 깨져셔야 돼 동해 공부해서 깨져셔야 돼디 또 소와 동해도 공부여봐. 소와 동해도 깨져셔야 사모 소와 동해도 저와 쪼우치니 깨져셔야 되고 얼봐. 디인도 다 단다데 남부산계베 동해 공부를 깨져셔야 돼디 소와 동해 공부를 깨져시기요 말에 두지기 동해 공부를 깨져시기요래. 어디 디시직디다.
The other way of explaining this is that when the Buddha said, or Buddha's teachings that urge one or encourage one to meditate on suffering, the word suffering here, if you recollect, suffering generally can be divided into suffering of change, and what we call conditioned or all-pervasive suffering. When the other people hear this, when the non-Buddhists hear that you have to reflect on suffering or realize suffering, the understanding of suffering that they are getting from these words is a kind of suffering that is still intimately tied with the suffering of suffering, which is the manifest feeling of suffering. And so the other way of understanding or explaining this is when the Buddha says one has to meditate on suffering, or one should meditate on suffering, the suffering that he refers to is not just the sensation or the feeling of suffering, but it is this conditioned, all-pervasive suffering.
소자다 디케제 디시에 윤두르다. 먼저 좀 전에 얘기 때문에 동영 공부도 송배 카도 될라 당보 될라 동이 셰버 차스는 송로다. 동이 셰버 차스. 디니 동이 하고 덴바오스. 아니 가르쳐 버렸을 때 덴데 동이 하고 덴바디 셰고레스. 디 동이 뭐 셰고레스. 동이 셰버 차스 송로와. 디 윤디 간솔라 다데샬라 틴디 동이도 마시 백갑지 여바인디 디 셰고고 여와. 다디 셰고고 여바인디 아니 디셰베체도 다 가르쳐 그래. 오 김생 거에체 아니 리바 가르쳐모 땅제 간다디 마도게 파도 둥에이 뭐 마시게 파도 세명이 뭐 만이게 파도 디 둥에이 뭐 곰구고였다. 소 둥에이 뭐 곰세디 둥에 마시바디 셰바체도 곰기였다.
In the sutra where the Buddha teaches the Four Truths, the Buddha says, this is the truth of suffering. And then he says, know the truth of suffering. And so when he says, know the truth of suffering, what the Buddha is saying is, there is a level of suffering that we do not currently know, and because we are not aware of it, or we haven't understood it, to understand that and make that known to us, the Buddha says, this is the nature of suffering. Or the Buddha says, this is suffering, know that this is suffering. And in the attempt to know suffering, there is all the various reasons and explanations and examples that the Buddha gives that lead to knowing what suffering is. And so the purpose of saying one needs to meditate on suffering is because the purpose of meditating on suffering is to make known something that currently is hidden to us or is unknown to us.
dire ta di indu ta dungi mashe ba di shebar chewe che do ani tenzi rigwa la so bo kwe che ta ka chue samlo tang ya da samlo tang che ko ga da dungi shebe lo di gyule ke gu gor wa ta dungi shebe lo di gyule ke sa so na dungi shebe lo di gyule ke sa so na ta thanda nga zo kariso gor di dame so do dame she se jela ani dame sheba zum gi phingi yo mare dendegi dame tela mine ta gom gyabche dame yimba tela ziji bi shini gom go gore ziji bi shini du gore ani dame tela mi bi ziji bi hadong du gore wa din na shin che che tene dungi phungbu dungi yimba tela nga zu shini du hadong du che che takara du che je zo ten gu gur westland tiba tang ba ina.
So when in the texts the Buddha says meditate on suffering, realize suffering, know suffering, in the same way that when the Buddha says this is selflessness and you have to realize selflessness, but in the realization of selflessness it's not sufficient just to know it once, but once you know it then you have to cultivate it, you have to strengthen it, and to strengthen it you have to cultivate shamatha directed on selflessness. Then that shamatha has to become vipassana. Then you have to cultivate that mind until it becomes a direct realization. And then that also has to be continuously sustained and familiarized and cultivated always more. In the same way that we know that selflessness is not sufficient to be known once, but requires this entire cultivating process that one has to still do, with respect to suffering also, is it the same? In the sense that after knowing what suffering is, do we have to develop calm abiding that is directed to suffering, develop vipassana directed to suffering, and then try and generate or have direct realization of suffering arise in us? Do we also have to do that in relation to suffering?
Till yundu tende mimba dobre. Ta dunge di kazoba do ngazo gomgores laba ina. Dunge di lenjik sheba ina ya tesamgi pingi mare. Dunge yimba shebi lodi semna la jeba meba cheje. Katu ina temba ya long tuya yuji. Yu tela ngazo ta danda dunge gom desagi dunge tela kapchik la ngazo dewe lo soraw dendegi samlo korea hengel dewe lo soraw dewa jungne soraw dendegi samlo nandu siya ko yungdu ko wa tema tha do lasan ngar dunge shebi lo digi zi simbi thone ti dunge ten ba sege ko do se chema mayimba hengel do siya changtuye yo dendiji macha ba to gom gorida.
So if we need to cultivate suffering to such a degree or not, if one considers that, it doesn't seem like that same level of effort is required. This does not mean that it's sufficient just to get it once and understand it once, because the reason one is reflecting or meditating on suffering is because it has like a use. And to ensure that one can make full use of it, the mind that has realized suffering should be able to be something that one recollects effortlessly. Because if one is able to recollect that effortlessly, then that can start acting like a stimulating factor or a ripening factor. And so the extent to which suffering should be cultivated is to a point where that realization of suffering leads one to effortlessly at all times, without requiring further reflection and further investigation and further recollection, one is able to realize it instantly or know it effortlessly. And what that results in is that this understanding of suffering then starts to permeate one's way of being and one's way of thinking, and it starts to influence all one's states of mind. Until such a level, one needs to familiarize or one needs to kind of cultivate the realization of suffering. Please, realization does not mean direct. Don't make that equation again and again, okay? Don't do that.
Soza ngela 딘데기 둥에라 미베 신의 죽고 요마다 딘데기 로직 죽고다.
That's why to realize suffering, one doesn't need to cultivate shamatha or calm abiding that is then focused on suffering. What one needs is a mind or a realization that is to this extent, is familiar with it to this extent.
소자 제름부체게 단다 먼저 남주 나선라 니중기 삼바기비 체데마 셰윤두가라 디셰여와 코베 분조라 아니 이미 기지점에 미기싱스 생각지 계지여와 이민 기지점에 미기싱스 단당 안주 이기 명밖에 돼서 이민 체대사기 네텔라 디 둥에 시베 로디 콤체 다 로디 당보 시베체 둥에 땡이 시베체 시베 로디 콤체 간다 코르비 핀소 칸디에지를 때바이나 심 딩닝 아주 이면체저와 디파 가체 디 이면체에게 삽델라 디 둥에 땡이 세 로이 템비 랑기 두 게이주 차바이나 바타가 디브시.
For instance, Lama Tsongkhapa in the three principal aspects of the path, if you remember, where he says, when he talks about what the extent of cultivating renunciation is when for not even one moment one is not drawn to the pleasures of samsara, he says. And what this means is when you reflect on suffering enough, what our mind is drawn to as a source of inspiration or what we're enchanted with is something that can be understood to be a source of suffering. And when one understands that as a cause for suffering or identifies that as a nature of suffering, and one is familiar with this understanding and realization to such an extent where not for a single second do we find some source of pleasure in anything that ordinarily we do, because our understanding and realization of the truth of suffering is so strong, at that point, till that point, one should cultivate a realization of suffering, and after this point onwards, it's not required, because that's kind of the purpose of cultivating it.
So that dindigi pungbu di dungye yimba tu gomche dindigi lo du gom yundu digi dungye di jangjang gom ane magi bashin deri ke jama yimba che dini pungbu di shibe pungbu dungye gi keje di samlo ko yundu ane pungbu di shiwar che yoda me pungbu di lemo go so yoda me digi cheba che ne ane pungbu di dungye pungbu di shiwa meba suhe yoba she meba suje gi nyembo yoba she ne dindi gi pungbu di meba suje gi nyembo khari ne nyembo dindi di gomche ani pungbu shiwa dindi gi gobang di ne tobar chegi sege dindi tobar chegi sege dindi gi dewa miksa chegi dindi gi dewa chumbu tela dunye gi samba choma mayimba 로 랑기 랑기 된된 얘기 삼로디 먹이기 par도 둥이도 검구고였다. 풍부 둥이 버도 검구고였다.
대화 챔벌란데 되기도 하게.
내가 지금 말한데 탈바들란데.
So for instance, when one has familiarized with such a state, with suffering to such a degree that one has understood it entirely and one's mind is not drawn to anything anymore, at that point, very naturally, there will be an inquiry into where does this come from, what are the causes that lead to it, is there some way that one can overcome these causes, is there some way that I can counter these causes so that I don't have to endure such a state again and again and again. And then when this inquiry further leads to realizing that it can be done and it can be, that these causes can be uprooted, and therefore there is a state which is freed from, or where there is a cessation of these causes that lead to suffering, and that state, which is liberation, then becomes one's main goal and objective, then naturally this earlier reflection will lead to a strong wish to attain this liberation single-pointedly, wholeheartedly. One's focus will shift entirely and it be directed at attaining liberation.
다 디 아고지 툴샤 캐란조 당보 풍부 둑된도 땡라팝 딕스와 딘시 리베 토네 풍부 둑된도 땡라팝네 아니 수숨기 따게 두자 체메 조제 풍부 둑된 시에베 제바 체마 당보 기기르와 계속 디디 캐란조 결 풍부 둑된 시에베 로 계사로 다 디젤라 아니 다 풍부 둑된 시에 차와 손자 다 풍부 둑된 고메 고쪽으로 베스라나 디젤라 시에 차베 젤라 다 풍부 둑된 고메 고쪽으로 베스 티와디 레바이나.
So please keep this in mind. First, like the starting point where one begins is, you start by using the three modes to prove that the aggregates are suffering. Then, when you have used these three modes to prove the thesis, you generate inference for the first time. This is the starting point. When you generate inference, which is the first moment of valid cognition where you realize for the first time that the aggregates are suffering, then at that point, if the question is, well, after having realized this, do I need to start cultivating it or meditating on it right away? What would you say? Do you need to start meditating on it right away? What would you say? What you realized, the aggregate's been suffering.
Yes? 다 풍부 두된도 시에사서와 풍부 두된도 시에사바던 풍부 두된가 랍송 검게에 메르다. 그래서
When you,
게 풍부 두된 시에사버다.
so you know that they're the nature of suffering. After you know that they're the nature of suffering, without doing anything else, immediately, if you just start there's no point in meditating on them immediately. You know that they're suffering. Inference knows what it knows, right? It knows its object. So you know that they're suffering. You don't need to meditate on that right away.
다 풍부 두된도 시에사비 제라. 대마 시에사비 디제들라 아니 풍부 두된기 검게에 파 샤제. 대마타 둥에디기 규카르리 제주시야 델로우시. 둥에 고메드 참샤니. 둥에 곰주메리. 랍사 두된도 시에사바 인디 다 풍부 두된 차바 인디 디기 규 디메바 스웨 요 마레스 디제주시야 고츠고다.
So whatever reflections or whatever analysis or meditation one has done to realize that it is the nature of suffering, once that is done, then you don't keep meditating on that. You stop and you move over to trying to find out what the causes of that suffering are. Immediately. The second you have that realization, you switch.
다 풍부 두된디 풍부 메버 스웨 요 마레스 오 디제주 당가 도스.
Because at that point you want to know whether the suffering can be removed or not, right? So immediately you go and see where it's coming from, what the causes are.
딕스와 다 풍부 두된디 메버 스웨 요 마레스 제주 당가 도윤디 암 풍부 두된디 규세바기 치기 요바 세바 자와 당징이 치기 요바 아니 딜레 용디 아니 당징기 신윤 다 유에다메 제주 상마 땡라 파파 도스.
So right after that, when you start to see what its causes are, you have to try and see if it has causes, what those causes are those causes the result of craving? If craving is the cause, what is the root of craving? Does craving really come from selfness, from the notion of a self? Does the self exist? All of this becomes your next step that you want to check right after.
다 메바 통윤디 아니 신이 당진 세룬이 버시 당진 세룬이 버시 윤디 아니 당진 세소나 당진 싸와신이 깨디에게 풍부디 레메고 차바 윤디 타르바세 가상가서 끼지시데 꼭받침이죠.
If you can prove that, or you understand, or you realize that there is no self, then knowing that there is no self, you for the first time know that self-grasping can be removed, or it is something that can be removed from the mind. When you know that it can be removed from the mind, then you know that in a state devoid of self-grasping, there is no more room for taking birth again through craving or through self-grasping, which then for the first time you realize that liberation exists. So this was the proof, if you remember, of how liberation exists. When you do this and you realize that liberation exists, then for the first time that is having proven that cessation exists, which is the third truth.
다 고과 체면 줍소마. 다 고과 체면 줍어다 계란기 줄라 고과 톰디글로 끼기시.
And the second you prove that liberation exists, along with that, naturally, there will be a wish to attain liberation.
와 고방문도 진디글로 끼기래데 딜로디 디네갑로디 팅팅직 끼기래데 고 무트니 인생꾼도 쇼게 야라나 gond아마 녜나 가르치는 삼로 나로라 타르바토고 세기 삼로 디모도 쿠르주 메주기 고방문도 진디글로디 탄달래요 말이.
So even though you have this wish to attain liberation at that point, this wish is too nascent, it's too delicate in the sense that it is not yet a wish that steers one's life, where it becomes like this burning wish where whether I'm walking, eating, sleeping, whatever I'm doing, my mind wishes to attain liberation. This wish has not become strong enough or potent enough to actually start steering one's life in that direction. It's still very nascent and fragile.
So the 디인도다 인생고도 타르바 되니글로게 딱 탑시 채고로 왔다. 타바 되니글로디 인생고도 깨대야지 베드랑 인간이 삼로 디나 코데지 속으로 와. 다 디소엘라 가르쳐 그래. 아니 신이 능력 공부. 다 능력 공부 고주 그래.
So then, because if you want to steer yourself in that direction, that has to become something that you want and you wish for ceaselessly, insistently, all the time. At that point, to generate this wish for attaining liberation or this wish for liberation and make that strong and impervious to all kinds of issues or movements, to make that strong and make this a continuous wish, that's when you start meditating on suffering. At that point. So do you know now clearly when one has to meditate on suffering? So someone who is now meditating on suffering, what kind of person that has to be should be clear. Because the person who's meditating on suffering is someone who knows that liberation exists, that cessation exists.
소자 고과 체면 줍 상이지게 아니 능력 고미운데 아니 소문 팔게 요 말이 그렇다.
Which is why someone who has realized that cessation exists, when they meditate on suffering, they don't get stressed out or anxious.
예당 셰당기기 말이다.
They don't have aversion or fear or all those things.
디 체면 마줍네 아니 능력 통 능력 셰 다가랑 곰다 가장 깨제 셰되기 이중된다 당인기세 콘도 끼용다 다래.
If you don't know that liberation exists and you keep reflecting on the truth of suffering, then this, if you remember the other day, this disenchantment is aversion. It itself is going to create all the various issues that are associated with solum, which is like stress essentially.
So the 디인도다 능력 고매데 가르치도께 능력 고매데 가르치도 검소.
So then why, like if you now reconsider the purpose for meditating on suffering, what is it?
타르바텔라 뒤니글로 랑킹하게 깨디야지.
To make that spontaneous, effortless. I have that effortlessly. Right?
딜라디다 타르바체면 마둠나 안 능력 검소나 딜링 말봐.
So if you don't know that liberation exists and you keep meditating on suffering, this won't just come as a byproduct, right?
Okay, but someone who knows that liberation exists is someone who has an inferential understanding of emptiness, no? So to me it seems then, any moment, so when then one meditates on suffering, one does not generate a mind, it's not accompanied with the realization of selflessness, no? So to me it seems like a waste, because it's just trying to generate a mind of selflessness all the time, no?
I don't understand the problem.
So in that moment, so a person who has an inferential understanding of selflessness is meditating on the nature of suffering.
Yeah.
And in that moment, he cannot generate you cannot meditate on it with a mind of selflessness, no, with a mind of
So you think someone who has realized selflessness and they're meditating on suffering?
Is it both together, or is it still he or she is just meditating on suffering without it
Okay.
accompanying?
Dunga toyagi goba di tharba drubya chidui. Tharba drubya la dame gi doyen di injimin togoris. Dame gi doyen toba mase ta di jela dame gi doyen ta goba ngon tseme drub sangi khansa gi jela yang khal lo ne dungyal gom yondu dungyal gombing gomge la dame gi doyen di nala legi yosamarwa la.
Dunga gombe lo nalo dame gi tuen legi ribes.
Dame gi doyen legi ribes. Te kisi dame gi doyen male na dungyal gombe lo tharba doyen du thobye gi chidu yis labgin la yang dungyal gomge lo di nalo la dame gi kowa me na ani dungyal gomba la pento kharitus la dinge takta chi khako ngindus.
Dunga gombe goba tanda sheso.
Is your question, first you realize suffering for the purpose of realizing liberation? What's your question? That's not clear.
So, what I understood now is that once one has a conceptual understanding of selflessness, one starts to meditate on suffering, on the nature of suffering. And to me, it seems like once you have an understanding of selflessness, one should only meditate on selflessness.
Dame goba on chair, goba send to the dame doing the tower. And the dame doing hako tsadu, young shambal dungyal down, then the gom day within a pendo tongumendus, the dame ran the shugiam the dogo series.
Body. Goba tseme trup sangi digi, goba tseme trup sangi digi, dame gombal goba tseme trup sangi jorwa, dindi midigi. 고과 롱문도 찬되기 삼보 로랑기 ngangi 깨지 마중나 네 가르치 그래 다음에 두저 요도 검길 흘레 요도 검길 아니 nga 텔라 서워에 내가 요디에서도 디 상마 다음에 검에디 상마 샤지 디가 셴바가 듀디그.
So someone who has realized liberation, like inferentially understood that liberation exists, that person, if they don't, this wish to attain liberation is not kind of spontaneously there, effortlessly there, their way of cultivating selflessness will also be when time permits or when they are able to. If they have other things that seem more other things might still seem more pressing or more important. And so when they can, they will cultivate selflessness. But the kind of the effort with which they will cultivate selflessness will be proportionate to how much they want to attain that liberation.
손자 다 단단히 깨제디 신일레레 소자 담에 고메디 카드 용거래라나 고방문도 전대로 좀 많이 깨 창에 강사되게 아니 담에 공부를 주고래 신이 담에 공부를 주고래.
So this was still to come, but when does one meditate on selflessness? And one meditates on selflessness when the wish to attain liberation is effortless. Up until then, you still have to cultivate the wish to attain liberation to a point when that is effortless, or that comes naturally. And then you meditate on selflessness from that point on.
그래서 대인도 다 등에 고메디 가르쳐도 예샤 당보 디고츠와체 등에 고메디 가르쳐도래도 고봉원도 진리로 좀만 임바 디기에게 쳐도스. 그래서
So what should be clear by what's being said here is the purpose of meditating on suffering is to create or cultivate an uncontrived wish. That's what you call it, right? An uncontrived wish to attain liberation.
야 나는 소리 티와 땅바 있나다. 인샤 추직 나로라. 개와 치마 꼴라 삼로 망아 거기도 세 디기 된다를 망아 삼로 거기도.
So
if
we just ask a question amongst each other, how much of your time is spent on concerns regarding the next life as opposed to concerns regarding this life? If you just ask. Which is more?
소자 개와 치마 또나야 펜도 요마리. 펜도 요마르스네 개와 치마 또 받점기 치마 되니길로 단당 아주 줄라 랑기 깨고 이렇게 두고면도 봐.
So it's clear, right? just because you might know that there is a next life, for instance, that's not sufficient. In and of itself, it's not sufficient to generate a wish to attain that next life.
다 탄당 아주 상만 깨와치마 또 상이체. 다 깨와치마 또 사례디 이나야 깨와치마 고 삼로디 랑기 랑기 체 딜리 깨와치마 망아 삼로 코에디 탄당 아주 가르치는 코르투요 말. 지바땅나.
And if you were to say, okay, so let's assume that we all are, let's assume that all of us here know that there is a next life. Okay? Are you all getting confused between words like know, realize? Is that clear amongst us at least? When you're going outside and talking to other people, please get confused. But know, realize are the same thing, okay? If, assuming we've all realized that there is the next life in this room, but somehow our thoughts are not directed at concerns about the next life, but they're directed more, or they are predominantly concerned with this life. If one was to ask why that is, why do you think that is?
Because we don't feel that all the time.
Why not though?
Yeah, we are not thinking about the next life.
That's the question, why?
딱 나서 체메 또 메나 nga 하고 마송 라초로와 다 체메 또 사로다 깨와치마 여보 또 사로와 다 깨와치마 그냥 된다 삼로도 슉충부 코마도 에 가르쳐.
So, if you don't know that it exists, then you can say, okay, I don't know it exists. We're assuming that we do know it exists. When you know it exists, is that sufficient to have this uncontrived, burning, constant desire that is concerned about next lives? Why not? What's lacking?
Because there's something more urgent now that we have to address. The next life seems a little distant and far.
다 지는디 초초초로 그래 있는 clear 단도 남아서.
It's in that direction, but it's not clear.
Yes.
Because we are not thinking about death.
성장. That's the point. So the 치와 미다보 고미에디 된다 디체들.
So meditating on death is for that purpose.
We all know 랑가지 치와 미다보 간 상마 신고로다. 신고로다. 이내야 치와 미다보 찍고지사래. 치와 미다보 가도 신고르데 치와 미다보 곰고르 베슬라나 곰고레. 가디 곰고레라나 깨와 치마 유여보 셰 산이 곰고레.
So it's the same thing. We all know that death is going to come. But when does one start meditating on death? Is when you have realized that there is a next life, is when you start meditating on death. Same thing. So if you don't know that there's a next life and you start reflecting on death, same problems will come. You get stressed, you get anxious, all the same things happen.
So for
instance, people who don't know about rebirth or haven't realized rebirth, if you talk to them about death, they don't like listening to it, right? The reason is because they don't know that there is a next birth. It's not nice to hear about death then. Whereas someone who knows that there is rebirth, when you talk to them about death, there's actual, instead of fear, there's happiness or joy when they hear about death. People who say that when I think about death and impermanence, it makes me sad and depressed, is because they don't know that there is a next life.
So the chiwon midaba kadu gomgore, chiwon midaba shebilo ken chiwon midaba komya mare. chiwon midaba she chawi jela shini khari chigre. Meba chare yangyo gigre say chiwadlin jeba dor.
So when do you, the distinction is clear, right? When do you know it and when do you meditate on it? When do you meditate on death? When you know that there is death, that's not when you start meditating on death. When you start meditating on death is when you know that there's death, you've wondered whether something happens after death, what are the causes for what will happen post-death, And when you know all those things, then you start meditating on death.
소소 시세베질라 매바 만로바 개와 치마 요바디 셰 개와 치마 요바디 셰 용디 개와 치마 요바 셰 사베질라 아니 개와 치마 요바 셰바 쌈기 치마 두니 로디 랑깅강기 탄데 게 두고 메와디 가서 영화 두고 요디 아니 같이와 미다 볼로디 개와 치마 세디 지금 말다 개와 치마 세야지 요르다 디 개첨보 임바디 로라 랑깅강기 용액이 셰도 아니 쟁규디 가리치고래 nga 신이 nga 시동이 미드레다 땐도 딩이 미드 마르다스 대야 가두시 마신 예바 메딩이 미드레다스 얘기 양이 양도 쟁규 제용도 아니 치마 땅아 세디경얄 고코나 디마손 치마 된다야지 깔리지다 야고 두세기 아니 로데 두 독슬레지 아니 강삼진이 세디의 치마니 제용디 치미기 된다라 셈나라 사모다야 망아디 레용데 nga 치마 돈이 로디게
So when you know, for instance, if you know that there is a next life, that doesn't naturally just translate into being concerned about it. So first you know that when this life ends, it's not the end, there has to be a next life. When you know that there has to be a next life, to make or like to start being concerned about that to a degree when one starts acting towards that, for that wish, that uncontrived concern about the next life to come about, then you start meditating on death. Because when you start meditating on death, what that does is, it reminds us that death is going to come, it's not the end, there's going to be something later. So I can't just keep focused on everything that's happening now, there's going to be something later. I can't get stuck on now. I have to focus also on that, I have to also work towards that. Not only do I know that I have to die, when death will come is uncertain, it could come at any time. Therefore, I really cannot sit around and pretend that it's not there. And therefore, I need to start working on that now. So the reflection on death, for someone who has realized that there is the next life, that then acts as the biggest stimulant to start cultivating the concern or acting in ways that are working towards the next life as well. That's when you start meditating on death.
베티나시레 디나시 지부지상시제 아니 고고요바 세메트루가 당게 메펜바체 다 수수기 룽아 이송기 젤뜨야 슈갭서 차상디 고보토베기 쇼라 주야기 삼로기 초창마 디강라 슈레기 체도 아니 두미 꼼기 따디시.
So it's exactly the same. When you know that there is liberation, that's not sufficient. Knowing that there's liberation, to make that realization also be accompanied with an uncontrived, constant, consistent effort that is working to attain that liberation, and therefore steering all of one's verbal, physical and mental actions to attain that liberation. That's why one meditates on suffering, to make that happen.
고봉우도 시도기로 좀 많이 먹겠소나 다 당기라오나시 당기 단당한조 세디낭로 딱가 가르쳐고래 상이 가르쳐 나와 지지라 가르쳐 세디경냐 삼로코디에 디파 가제 개와 치마경냐 삼로코디에 당기 로딘데지 약표소 다 개와 치마를 가르쳐고래서 삼로 대잠 대양파 가제 다 뱃고로 풍부 둑딘 시봉 고바토고도 세기 삼로 딘데지 간로 베 가두인 로디 딘데지 간로 로딩이 미디기 딱 가르쳐가도 그래.
So kind of like if you have cultivated this uncontrived wish for liberation, much like an uncontrived wish for the next life, which means when you have this burning concern about what's going to happen the next time around, you're not stuck on immediate pleasures concerned with this life, but you're working towards a larger goal. Similarly, when your now concern goes beyond that still, and you're not concerned with this life and the next life only, but you want to attain a state which is freed, or is the cessation of the aggregates, and that's your goal, and now you have this kind of uncontrived wish that is constantly wishing for that, what will you start doing at that point? What do you do then? Or what will you do then? What would one do then? On?
Yes. 다 고보 되니로 좀 많이 먹게 되는 미디기 딱 가르치기래라나 다 담에 곰 그렇다.
Then they'll start meditating on suffering.
다 동네 공부가 누구 말해.
There's no point meditating on selflessness. Sorry, there's no point meditating on suffering anymore.
그 바로바로로 검초고 이길 때네. 다 저 가리 공부가 그래. 담에 공부가 그래.
They might do it like as a side thing every now and then. But the main purpose from what they will exert themselves wholeheartedly on is selflessness.
그래서 다 담에 고명원이 디술 리비도
So who are those who really meditate on selflessness?
어디 디기다 담에 다 곰도 그렇다. 슉짠도 그렇다. 다 단당 안저 담에 곰벌 슉 말해야지 가려 어디다.
So those kind of people will naturally have this kind of force or this intensity in the way that they cultivate selflessness. Our compromised intensity is because of all the reasons that we just said.
그래서 딘딜로께 딩이 미디기 가르치 그래. 내가 შემ발레 윤데 I don't have time for that 레그다. nga di ko dame gom go nga di che tu mindu legda.
So such a person who's attained that kind of uncontrived wish for liberation, when they have other things that come up or like other commitments, they'll say that I don't have time for that. I have to do this.
단당 안졸 가리 요래 안졸 땀이 유디 담에 곰기라 셴바 내가 들리 용디 담에 please wait. I don't have time to meditate on selflessness legra.
No.
Di discourse tamongen 내가 디체고 yes.
So in our case, it's quite the opposite, where when we have time, then we meditate on selflessness. But when we have more pressing commitments, then we wait, let selflessness sit on the side and wait and do what we deem more pressing or important, which is our normal things.
그래서 다대 차랑 아주 담에 셴나요 곰기 말해.
Which is why even if we know selflessness now, we won't cultivate it. We won't meditate on it.
부릅 가리 요래 나도 치와 믿어 시기 요래 곰고 말 부릅 띠르다.
What's proof for that? Proof for that is we know that death exists, but we don't cultivate next lives at all.
말해. 치와 믿어 셴나요 나도 치와 믿어 곰기 말.
But we don't meditate on death. We know that it's there, but we don't meditate on it. Sorry. Yeah.
그래서 치와 믿어 가지는 곰기요 말에 어디 디치고 직상 딘낭시 가서 고봉우도 신대로 좀만 많이 받으면은 담에 셴나요 가서 곰기 말해.
So why we're not meditating on it is because similarly, the same reason why we're not meditating on death is the same reason why until we have an uncontrived wish for liberation, we're not going to do anything about that, about selflessness.
림바드 레스와 소자다 가리 곰기도 가디 곰기도 림바 딜 남기 림바스 딜이다.
So is this clear? Like when you say stages of the path, this is it. So there's stages of what you meditate along the path. So the stages of the path means stages of what meditations you cultivate and what comes first and what comes after. That order should be clear.
다디 림바디 메나는 아주 축돼 딜. 림바디 마시나 강에 책이었다.
So the point of why we speak of the stages of the path or stages of meditation is because if you don't know the order in which they are cultivated, then you don't get the appropriate results. So then that's when that's where you fall short.
다디 림바디 아주 싸워 속에 개 말에 좀 전에 코랑게 송래. 둥엘 셰버차. 군중 빵거차. 고봉 온도차. 람 곰버차. 림바 디기 단다 셰디기 가디 곰고 이메다 가리가리디 이메 뿌라 냠닝 림바디 디날 숭기였다.
So there's nothing new that we've come up with. This is what the Buddha said when he said, no suffering.
둥엘 셰버차.
Remove the causes, realize cessation or actualize cessation, and then meditate on the path. So these four, the Buddha himself has said that, and in this teaching, is that okay? Realize suffering, abandon the causes, actualize cessation, and meditate on the path. The Buddha is already giving the order of how to do this.
다 줍는디 도 코로나를 림바 대가랑 검 냠닝기 림바 대가랑 송바 나시 다른 세만남들 리윈니베 디나로 림바 대가랑 송고 디시겐 거다.
So, exactly in accordance with how the Buddha has spoken of this order or these stages in the sutras, here Acharya Dharmakirti in the Pramanavartika, he's exactly doing that. He's explaining it according to that order.
손자다 탄다 두지 둥에 라고네 둥에 검버 송바인 슬랍데 디기 낭로라 탄다 림바 대가랑 디시겐 거다.
So here where Acharya Dharmakirti says, with conditioned suffering in mind, meditating on suffering was said, this entire order that we've just mentioned, it's all there. The content is all there in this.
소자다 디치디 냐만이 퇴사를 가서 치디 방고 퇴를 망고 삼여데 이나얀 치디 nenga 도스도스임바 겐게 소소 겐게 비디슈자 겐게 또 코랑이 곰 냠뇽게 림바도 자네 마도시 라마트게 바도 칙직부게 가도 롤 차동메도 와 림바디.
And these words, I mean, these words we've been seeing them for years, but when we were studying them, just by reading them, didn't really seem to, wasn't sufficient. And so until the teachers who were teaching these texts were not able to explain them, connecting them to their own experience or connecting them to their own reflections and meditations, these words somehow didn't come alive. We didn't really understand what these words meant.
소자다 디인데 타르바토베치도 조 가르곰고고도.
So now, what is the main thing that one needs to meditate to attain liberation?
남의 고메데 차송아 남의 고메데 가디 연구도.
When does one meditate on selflessness?
타바토니 글로 점에 디 가디 연구래.
And when does that come, the uncontrived wish for liberation?
소자 낭바상기 비슈네 동해 고메 숨게 고바티레 두제 동해 라고네 동해 고버 숨바 인세 치디 된다 되다.
So that's the meaning of this. With conditioned suffering in mind, meditating on suffering was said.
다 치루바기 동해 고메데 낭비 동해 고메니 파롤 키아버지 두메도 다.
So is there a difference between how Buddhists speak of meditating on suffering and how the and how non-Buddhists are speaking of meditating on suffering? See for yourself.
소자다 가지기 계란 알아 동해 고버 숨바데라 견지 시부 제바이나 계란도 동해 고버 숨고도 찍바로 와 슬라디 아니 랑루기 찍바 마리 슬레트인다 되다.
So when they say, well, you keep complaining about our meditations on suffering as if they're inadequate, but then you yourselves turn around and meditate on suffering, what's the deal with that? When they complain, and Acharya Dharmakirti here says, no, they're not the same. Is it clear where the difference is between how they're meditating on suffering?
디직레다 디직 디소아 다디니 디시 셴바지야 다 양게 디시 셴바지 다 디시 셴바지 가리요레스나 다 두지기 등에 곰용데 두지 등에 곰용데 카디스 곰가 두지 등에 곰용데 당고 두지기 등에 미김생 가래.
So that's one. Then there's another kind of perspective, if you will, which is when you meditate on, you know, in English when we say all pervasive suffering, just so that this is clear, it's, if you want to translate everything that is being said in Tibetan or in Sanskrit, it's all pervasive conditioned suffering. Okay, is that okay? So oftentimes, actually you only find conditioned suffering, oftentimes you find pervasive suffering, but this English, almost like an acronym that we've made out of it, which is all pervasive suffering, is partial in what it's trying to explain. Is that okay? So here, now when we're talking about meditating on suffering, you see in the first line it says conditioned suffering, right? How do you meditate on conditioned suffering? That's the next question. How do you do it?
Well, first one has to realize using interest. And then I think it becomes more clear after that.
제바기도 공부와 제바기도 공부와 등에 공부인데 sometimes 거라 등에 삼들은 디딕 말어 등에 알두슬은 디그와 다 풍부 등에 레셈나 풍부 등에 란두스 대데나 디 등에 공부로 두그레베 야 등에 공부다 샴바지요.
So the question is like this first, before you on that. If you sit and you say everything is suffering and you just kind of keep saying that, does that qualify as meditating on conditioned suffering? Okay. So how do you do it?
The four aspects of suffering: impermanence, suffering, empty.
Doing number shige.
중요 넘버시 대야 렌직레
That's
다
also.
다동야 마직 라바이나 다동 마직 라바이나 듀시나
If you kind of make that even more concise.
Facilities and take contaminated aggregates, they are suffering because they are under the control of karma.
다 줌제 가장 아주 쉬운 날로 줌제니 송요와 풍부도된 임바들 줌제니 송바 튕겨도 봐.
Do you remember the two reasons that were given in the text for proving that they are suffering?
디섬다. 동영곰도 디섬다. 방고.
When you think of suffering, the two ones are, one, it is the fault basis of faults, or the support of all faults, and the other one, it is powered by karma and afflictions.
손자다 디니디 섬노땅 거래. 디인데 자와카레 자와교다.
What's the root verses that explain this?
Because they are the support of all forces and under the power of causes and under the control of causes, they are suffering.
눈이 걸어진 풍보스. 다디 김제 마셰인데 규당 예비된 시리앙스로 니스에 걸어. So 디인데 다 규리뉴기 샤완진 임바당 아니 예비된 임바직도 계제도와. 소자다 디니가를 삼모당을 공부했다. 단다 풍부디기 ngami linyi ki xiangwan chi ni ngami linyi ki xiangwan phungbu ta linyi ki xiangwan ji bi cha ne rang me ba to do se ji sam ba ya chik che tene phungbu di ki ting ne ani dungye la so ba so xiamba ki ta dungye nang ga khari ni ke ga na wi dungye la so ba dungye nam rang khari nyong ai ke je she gi ne de sang dungye ki nyong ai ki te phungbu di ki chi gi du se gi ne be ten che gi sam di ya do se je ko di ni ga sam tang che ani phungbu du den do kom ko yo.
So when one is meditating on suffering, what one is meditating on is both of these parts, both these aspects. One is that they are under the power of karma and afflictions, which means whatever they are is entirely conditioned by karma and afflictions. And the other one is that the state that they have is one which is the base or the support where all problems or obstacles will arise. So it is the base of all faults. Both of these aspects are considered when one is thinking of them as conditioned suffering.
We'll stop.